We've seen months of protests, rioting, looting, and violence. Most recently, we saw some very disturbing scenes from the U.S. Capitol building. There seems to be so much confusion over when violence is necessary, when and if it's acceptable, especially when it comes to political action. So, is there any basis for comparing the events of the past several months to the American Revolution? I've heard that several times. And how should Christians think about these issues? I'm Adam Tucker with Southern Evangelical Seminary, and this is Why Do You Believe? Well, it's been a while since our last live stream and even podcast. We have been working a lot behind the scenes to revamp the show, so hopefully we won't have too many technical difficulties today as we learn some of these new software packages and things that we're using. We're hoping to offer weekly content. We'll see how that goes. It's an ambitious schedule, but we're going to give it a shot. And so we want you to be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel, like our Facebook page. Click the bell in YouTube so you know when we're going live. And be sure to download our mobile app. We'll be live streaming to our mobile app and hopefully eventually to the SES website as well. And you can find links to all of those things at ses.edu. So the videos, of course, will be available for on-demand viewing. And then we'll post the audio of these same shows as our weekly podcast. So you'll have a few different options as to how to consume that content. So again, we hope to post these things weekly and pray for us. We'll see how that goes. We have a lot of ideas, so we'll see what happens. Also, just with the show format, we're hoping to have a little bit of fun. We're hoping to provide some very useful content in the process. And for starters, something I used to do when I was a chapter director with Ratio Christi a number of years ago, we always had a fallacy of the week. And so we'd pick a logical fallacy, explain what that means, give some examples. And of course, logical thinking has just completely gone out the window today. So we're going to start with a fallacy of the week, and we'll see how this goes. So this week's fallacy of the week, I think, is very pertinent to things we're seeing today, and it's called the bandwagon fallacy. I'm sure many of you are probably familiar with this, but the bandwagon fallacy essentially is appealing to the popularity of a view or an idea, or appealing to the number of people who hold a particular view or idea as a way to validate your holding of that particular view or idea. And of course, we see this everywhere today. Through the spring and even the summer, we saw so much virtue signaling from major corporations, even many of my friends and different people who, everybody's posting a black box on their Facebook page. So, hey, that must be the right thing to do. No argument for that, just everybody's doing it, so they can't all be wrong, right? So that's an example of the bandwagon fallacy, but the number of people that hold a particular view says nothing about whether that view is correct or whether that idea is true. It may be, it may not be, but how many people think that is completely irrelevant to the truthfulness of a particular claim or particular idea. Of course, we see this all throughout politics. And just everywhere we look, it's the latest fad, the latest social justice issue someone's supposed to get behind, whatever the case may be. We see it constantly. So the bandwagon fallacy is this week's fallacy of the week. Don't be guilty of committing it, and be on the lookout for it because, again, it pops up everywhere. So let me hide this. Again, I'm learning all the software and everything here. Honestly, the bandwagon fallacy is one of the things that has been contributing to much of the ongoing violence and things that we have seen over the last several months as people jump on the bandwagon and join in the craziness. So that leads us to the topic of today, which is Christianity, politics, and violence. And with us today, let's see if I can get this to work here. I'm going to bring in our guest, hopefully. There we go. Dr. Land, can you hear me? Oh, I can't hear you though. Hang on just a second. Let's see. That and you are not muted. Nope, I'm still not hearing you. Love technology when it works. I can see you though. Let's see here. The fun of new shows and new technology. All right, so you are there visually. Guest has muted themselves. So you should have a mute button on your end. If you can unclick that little microphone icon. Let's see here. This is the first time we've tried the interview mode. Nope, still can't hear. There should be a little microphone icon that you can unmute, unmute, mute, unmute. You are still muted for some reason. Yeah, you can try logging on with your phone if you want, and I'm going to switch back to this shot for the time being. We'll figure this out. We'll go ahead and introduce Dr. Land. He is my boss, who's probably not happy with me right now, and the president of Southern Evangelical Seminary. So he's been with SES for, I think about 7 years now, somewhere thereabouts, and 7.5. I can read his lips. And he served 20 plus years at the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission with the Southern Baptist Convention. So he has been around the world of politics and public policy and ethics and all of those issues for decades. He's also served on President Trump's Evangelical Advisory Board, so obviously has interesting perspective to share there also from that particular point of view. And as soon as we get the sound working here, we'll jump into the actual topic at hand. And let's see, it is still showing you muted on your end. Dr. Lane, if you want to try logging in with your phone, the video quality won't be quite as good, but if we can get the sound to work, it'll be fine. Stand by for just a moment. Always fun kinks to work out. So I will tell you, let me switch over to this shot while we're waiting on that. If you are interested in learning more about Southern Evangelical Seminary or how you can study with us, maybe you're not sure whether a seminary degree or certificate or anything like that is right for you, I would encourage you to visit degrees.ses.edu/podcast, and you can download a free ebook that we have for you there. And I think it's some really good information, some challenging information, and hopefully you will avail yourself of that. All right, let's switch back over to this shot, and we will see if we can remove this one, and we're going to add this. Now let's see if we can hear you. Dr. Lane, can you hear me? It's still saying you have muted yourself. That is very odd. Well, the best laid plans, as they say. Let's see. If you're wondering about the podcast, we'll edit this part out so you won't have to listen to all the technical difficulties. I'm going to switch back to this shot for the moment. I apologize. If we can't get it to work out, we'll reschedule and just do it again. At least we're not paying for airtime and nobody else's time. That's the joys of live streaming. But then these things happen, which is not the joys of live streaming. All right, we're going to try again here. I think we're trying one more device. Once again, my apologies. I love dead air. Isn't that lovely? I have run out of things to say to stall. I need a good joke, I suppose. Hey, have you heard the one about... All right. Christina, can you hear me? Okay, I'm going to add you in, Christina, and see if I can hear you.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
Hey, there we go. It's
Can you
working.
hear us?
I can.
You hear? You can. Okay, yay.
Well, that was the problem. It was keyed to you, not me.
All right.
Well, sorry
Apologies
about that.
once again.
It was, I'm using my secretary's iPad, and it was keyed to her, not me. So
No problem. No problem. All right. Well, we are glad that we got it to work. We're glad to have you. Thank you for taking the time to be with us. So we're delayed, but we're still going to have a little bit of fun first before we jump into things. So anybody who knows anything about SES knows that we hold pretty strongly to the philosophical foundations of Thomas Aquinas. And if you're familiar with Aquinas's writings, he would lay out questions about a particular view that people would ask. And then he would have an on the contrary part of his writings where he would kind of make the turn to then provide his own thoughts about whatever subject he was writing about. So we're going to have a segment called On the Contrary. All right. So, Dr. Lynn, I'm going to add you back in here. What we're going to do here, I've got 30 seconds on the clock, and I'm going to ask you some either or, just silly questions. You give us your thoughts, and just to have a little fun and get to know a little bit more about you. So let me get the clock started, and here we go. All right, pecan or pecan?
pecan.
Pecan. Pepsi or Coke? I know the answer to this one.
Coke Zero.
Coke Zero. I'm right there with you. Krispy Kreme or Dunkin' Donuts?
Krispy Kreme.
All right, that's a good North Carolina man right there. We've transformed you. I know the answer to this one. Steak or chicken?
Steak.
Good
Rare.
Texan.
Rare steak.
Let's see. Early riser or night owl?
A night owl.
Night owl, big time. If you know Dr. Land's schedule, it is insane. Oh, that is 30 seconds. Man, that goes quickly. So, just to get to know our guest a little bit and have a little bit of fun.
By the way, Adam, we are interested in using language precisely here. I want to give you an example. Mark Twain said the difference between lightning and a lightning bug is the difference between the right word and almost the right word. Here's lightning. When Krispy Kreme, the New York Times did a food review on when Krispy Kreme came north, and she said, I'm trying to describe Krispy Kreme to Northerners. She said, they're evil little lard pods of joy. Now that's lightning.
That is exactly right. No doubt about that. All right. Well, Dr. Land, let's jump into our actual topic for today. I know you and I have talked about this some, and I know in my lifetime, I've never seen anything as crazy as this. Of course, I didn't live through the Vietnam War and many other things.
Well, I wrote an op-ed just recently for the Christian Post, and I talked about the fact that any of us who lived through 1968 are having memories brought back to us. Anyone who lived through 68 will never forget it, and it's beginning to look like 68.
Some scary thoughts, and what I think is ironic I noticed this when the violence first started back in the spring with the rioting and the looting and those sorts of things. Many on the left who were especially supporters of the Black Lives Matter organization and kind of their radical agenda were comparing the violence to the American Revolution. And of course, now I've seen people on the right and even Christian brothers and sisters who are comparing what happened at the Capitol last week or last several days to the American Revolution. So we have these people, extremists on the right and the left, holding what I would consider some rather extreme views, who are both comparing their actions to the American Revolution. Is there any comparison to be made there?
No, none whatsoever. Zip, nada, zero.
Why is that?
Well, you might have a surface connection in that you had the Boston Tea Party and things like that, which were certainly demonstrations. I'm not sure how violent they were, but they were demonstrations. Um, when the American colonists decided that they could no longer live under British rule, um, they came together in the Continental Congress. They elected representatives to a Congress, and the representatives issued a Declaration of Independence. And 80% of the Declaration is listing all of the things that the king has done that he's forfeited his right to be the ruler.
Mm-hmm.
And they believed in the consent of the governed. So they formed a new government. And that new government authorized the raising of an army to defend the independence of the new country. In the Declaration it says, when in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to separate themselves from another, it is incumbent upon them to explain the reasons that impel them to the separation. And so they had tried peaceful redress of grievance and had not succeeded. But they did not take up private arms. They did not take up private violence. They did not take into themselves the right to have mob violence. They formed a new government, a new Romans 13 government. Mm-hmm. And that new government, which had been elected by the people, then authorized the raising of an army to defend that independence. And that's a very big difference. And when it comes to, I would argue that what they did in the revolution would not be justified under our system of government, because what they built into it in the First Amendment is we have the right to peaceful redress of grievance. So the threshold for even government authorized rebellion is much higher when you have peaceful redress of grievance. The American colonists had no peaceful redress of grievance. They'd exhausted it and had not been able to get any relief. I remember teaching a class in ethics a few years ago, and we were talking about nonviolent protest and what Dr. King and the civil rights movement did in the 1950s and 60s. And I would encourage everyone listening to, before they go to bed tonight, go online and read the letter from the Birmingham jail, written by Dr. King in 1963, in which he lays out, I'm in this jail because I refuse to obey an unjust law. And it's unjust because it doesn't coincide with the moral law of God. But he didn't use violence. He rejected violence. He said violence is counterproductive, and we don't have a right to violent protest, but to nonviolent protest. But the threshold for nonviolent protest is higher for me than it was for Dr. King, because Dr. King couldn't vote. In 1963, the state of Alabama systematically excluded African Americans from voting. Mm-hmm. Now, when you can vote, you have much more of a peaceful redress of grievance. If you don't like the results of an election, do a better job the next time and you win the next election. Mm-hmm. And so that makes the threshold, even for nonviolent protest, pretty high.
Right. I want to come back to Dr. King in just a minute. But I want to explore this thing that I've seen a lot of my very passionate, shall we say, Christian brothers and sisters saying that, yes, we can vote and we have those rights as Americans and we have this form of government. But, there's a lot of, I'm not advocating this, I'm just being devil's advocate, I guess. There's a lot of information being thrown around out there that the election was rigged, that our vote doesn't matter, that it's all corrupt. And so they're saying, the founding fathers would be proud of what happened at the Capitol. What else did you want people to do? Because their vote wasn't heard. So how can we navigate some of these honest feelings that people are having that aren't always based on 100% fact and just not sure what
First
to
of
do
all,
with
I think the fact you used the word feelings. I mean, I think that John Adams and Thomas Jefferson and George Washington would be appalled at what happened at the Capitol
it.
last Wednesday, as any person who's committed to democratic government should be.
Right.
The Were there irregularities in this election? Yes, there were. Were they enough to sway the election? I don't know. We perhaps will never know. I think that the fault lies in not having challenged some of these procedures before the election. It's awfully hard to prove fraud after the election.
Right.
You need to show it beforehand. We should have been going to court to overturn this Pennsylvania Supreme Court's unconstitutional decision to countermand the legislature before the election, not after the election. The reality is that our Constitution leaves it to the state legislature in each state to decide how the people in that state are going to vote. If you remember back to the Gore versus Bush election in 2000, in the end, the Supreme Court ruled 7-2 that Florida could not count votes the way they were counting them because they were counting them differently in different counties. That has to be a statewide. It has to be a statewide standard. And then, secondly, then they voted 5-4 that it was December 11th or whatever it was, and time had run out. It was time for the Electoral College to vote, and so they voted. So Pennsylvania should have been countermanded, and we should have been more aggressive. Republicans should have been more aggressive in challenging in court the mail-in ballots before the election. And I think one of the things that we have to do between now and 2022 is in each state legislature do our best to clean up that process. And the Republicans did gain 2 more state legislatures. We control a majority of the state legislatures now in the country. And so at least in the majority of those states, we ought to be able to clean the process up and make it crystal clear that it is the state legislatures that do this. Now, also, I would say, we underestimated our opponents. If you read Rules for Radicals by Saul Alinsky, which is the playbook for the modern Democratic Party, anything goes. It doesn't matter if it's not honest, as long as the end justifies the means.
Right.
So in 1996, Robert Dole walked into Bill Clinton's office in the Oval Office and said, "I wish you'd quit lying about my record." And the president's reply was, "Well, you do what you got to do." He didn't even deny. He didn't even deny. He didn't even deny that he was doing it. He said, "Well, Bob, you do what you got to do."
Wow. So where's that threshold then from, I guess, between due process, our Constitution, all of those things, versus the deep state corruption or whatever you want to call it, that lends itself to action?
Well, we have peaceful redress of that. There's not anything that happened in this election that can't be fixed by nonviolent means. Maybe not in time for this election.
Right.
But it can't be fixed by nonviolent means. And that raises the threshold tremendously for violent protests. And even then, I believe that for it to be moral, you would have to have the people form a new government. And then the new government would authorize the use of force to defend the new government.
Would that be the case in the Civil War, for example?
Well, yes. It's interesting. George W. Bush had this belief that if we could increase democracy in the world, we would decrease war. And his argument, circumstantially, was pretty good. Let's say from 1800 onward, how many wars were caused by a democratically elected government attacking a democratically elected government? Well, I can only find one, and it's the American Civil War,
Mm-hmm.
where the Confederate States seceded and then committed an act of war against the United States in attacking Fort Sumter. But the flaw in that argument is that not all the people in the Confederate States could vote.
Mm.
First of all, women couldn't vote, and African Americans couldn't vote. They were property.
Yeah.
And so what you had in the Civil War was a government elected by white males attacking another government elected by white males, which does tend to skew the argument a bit.
Sure.
But yes,
It wasn't anarchy, though. Even though it was
no,
corrupt,
that's
it
right.
wasn't anarchy.
That's right. The Confederacy, the states seceded as states and declared their independence from the United States, and then they formed the Confederate States. The Confederate States were formed after the secession of the states, and I think 7 of the 11 states did it by plebiscite. They did it by a special election. The other states did it by vote of their state legislatures, but it was done by vote. But interestingly, and I found this somewhat shocking, if you look at the plebiscite states, the highest percentage of the vote for secession was in the state of Texas, which that doesn't surprise me. What surprised me was it was only 61%. That was the highest.
Right.
So less than 60% of the white males in the other states voted for secession. So it was not this overwhelming mandate. Then, of course, we would have to argue that the American Revolution was not an overwhelming mandate either. We didn't have polling back then, but it's estimated that probably no more than 40% of the population were active in supporting the revolution. And a good percentage were just saying, just don't fight on my farm.
Right.
They were neutral.
Mm-hmm.
And you have battles like the battle at Kings Mountain, which is near our campus here in Charlotte, which is one of the most significant battles of the Revolutionary War. And every person who participated in the battle, except one, was born in the United States. Oh, wow. All the soldiers on the British side and all the soldiers on the American side were born in America. And the only person that was not was the commanding general for the British, who was born in Britain.
Interesting.
Wow. The Revolutionary War, the Civil War was not really a civil war. It was a war between sections of the country. There were not very many Confederates in Minnesota, and there were very few Unionists in Mississippi. In the Revolutionary War, it really was brother against brother and father against son. For instance, Benjamin Franklin's son was a loyalist, and he broke with his father over the Revolution, never spoke to his father again.
Wow. Goodness. I certainly hope we don't come to another civil war or anything like that. But I do think, well, it's like much of anything in theology or these social justice issues even. We have so few categories, I guess, in which to think and distinctions that need to be made that people aren't making and just jump to one extreme or the other.
They use historical analogies that are disanalogous.
Mm-hmm.
And it's George Wallace, Martin Luther King Jr., the frustration that the civil rights movement experienced, that it was not an overnight success. It took a long time. There were those within the civil rights movement who wanted to resort to violence. There were the Stokely Carmichaels and the Black Panthers, etc. And Martin Luther King Jr. Adamantly opposed it and said that he was philosophically and theologically opposed to it. And then he pointed out it's also counterproductive. He said it is counterproductive. When you resort to violence, he said, every time there's a riot, it helps George Wallace. And I think we can see that in what happened last Wednesday. The mob riot at the Capitol has done more damage to the conservative cause than any single event that I can think of in the last 20 years. Probably the most damage that's been done to the conservative movement since Watergate. Because the secular news media and the fake news media have clamped upon it, and they've tried to paint every Trump supporter as someone who would riot and would seek to take over the Capitol. When the reality is that 99% of the people that were there, that was the furthest thing from their mind. It was a peaceful protest. I know people that were there. Mm-hmm. I was not. I know people that were there that tell me that there were buses of people in camouflage that showed up at the end of the march and led the attack on the Capitol.
And that just goes back to our inability to make distinctions. We can't even wait for information to come in before we're jumping to
That's right.
these conclusions and classifying every Trump supporter as a domestic terrorist, and it's absolute insanity.
Well, I mean, they're trying to make this into a new 9/11, and that these people are domestic terrorists.
Mm-hmm.
That is dangerous nonsense.
Yep.
But whenever it's like, generals and others say that battle plans work until the first shot's fired, and then all the battle plans go out the window. Or like if you're in a boxing match, you have a plan until the first time you get hit in the nose, and then from then on it's all improvisation. Mm-hmm. Violence begets violence, begets violence, begets violence.
Yeah. And
that's why it was so disturbing to see the lack of response to the violence that was taking place in places like Minneapolis and Seattle and Portland this last summer and fall. And it helps lead to the kind of thing that happened at the Capitol.
Mm-hmm. So let's talk about that violence a little bit more. And we've mentioned Dr. King. We just celebrated his life and work yesterday, as a matter of fact. Throughout the spring and the summer, his one little quote about writing being the voice of the
unheard.
What is it? I'm sorry.
Of the unheard.
Of the unheard. Yes. That got thrown around a lot. So can you put some context to that for us?
Well, Dr. King was seeking to explain the violence without condoning it. He never condoned it, but he was trying to explain it, that you have a frustration level because people don't feel that they're being heard. And I think that was certainly true of African Americans and their complaints in the 1950s and the 1960s, and to some degree today. But if you follow that truism, then the violence that was expressed on behalf of conservatism is because many conservatives feel unheard. I mean, the Trump movement is a product of that. Patrick Cardell, who was at one time the boy wonder 25-year-old pollster for Jimmy Carter when Jimmy Carter won the White House in 1976. And Patrick went on to become a leading pollster in the United States. In 2014, during the election cycle, he went on Fox News afterwards, and he said, I am very, very disturbed by the level of unrest and the level of unhappiness that I'm experiencing in polling. It's bipartisan. It's just under the surface. And he said, there's a pitchfork rebellion coming to Washington. And the Washington establishment has no idea that it's coming. Well, I think that what he picked up was the frustration that led to both the Bernie Sanders, burning for Bernie, and the Trump movement. You had this ridiculous situation in early 2016 where a significant number of people, their first choice for president was Donald Trump, and their second choice was Bernie Sanders, and vice versa. People whose first choice was Bernie Sanders and their second choice was Donald Trump. Now that makes no sense. I mean, logically, in terms of a left brain, that makes no sense. But right-brained, it does, because you had people that felt frustrated, that felt like the Washington establishment was functioning for its own good and not for the good of the country. Mm-hmm. Millions and millions of people whose livelihoods have been destroyed by globalism, people who live between the coasts, who do not feel that their government pays any attention to them, or alternatively, as Hillary Clinton put it, sees them as deplorables. I was actually watching that speech on television when she gave it, and I came right up out of my chair when she said that half of Trump's supporters were a basket of deplorables, and I'm going, oh my soul, that has to be an ad lib. Surely no one would write that in a speech, because it's one thing to attack your opponent. It's another thing when you attack your opponent's supporters
Mm-hmm.
and denigrate them, because they're the ones you're trying to convince to vote for you. I thought that was the moment at which Hillary Clinton lost that election. But there is, and to the extent that Trump's people, his supporters, feel unheard, they're more likely to riot. The more that they feel that they do not have a legitimate redress, or that their complaints are not being heard, and they're not being heeded. Mm-hmm. And so, to the extent that people try to shut down the expression of Trumpism, and that's what's happening now. With if they can block the president of the United States, they can block anybody. If they can censor him, they can censor anybody, and that's what they did with what Twitter did. And I think that the high tech monopoly and oligarchy has to be broken up. I think historically the analogy that we have is that Google and Facebook and Twitter and Apple, they have a monopoly, just like Standard Oil had a monopoly on energy in the late 19th century. Mm-hmm. And the federal government had to enact the Sherman Antitrust Act to ensure competition and to ensure that what Apple and Facebook and Twitter did to was it Parler?
Yeah.
What they did to them cannot be done, because that is the squelching of competition, and we have laws that impact that, called antitrust laws, and I think that that high tech conglomerate has too much power, and the government needs to insist that it be broken up.
Yeah, it is a mess right now. It is certainly a big issue, and we rely on those things so much just for our daily communications now.
I heard a commentary last night that I thought had a lot of weight to it. It said that it's not really so much liberal or versus conservative; it's establishment versus non-establishment. The Washington establishment does not want to be criticized, and some people on Twitter have larger followings than people that watch the evening news. And what they want to do is they want to get back to, you only get what we tell you. Now that's the way it was back in the late 60s and the early 70s. Mm-hmm. You had the three networks.
Right.
And the three networks were, all the same in their philosophy, and conservatives did not have a voice. That's why Fox News was such a success when it started, because it gave an alternative. And I would say to you that conservatives would not have won any of the victories they've won if they had not had that alternative outlet. In 1968, for instance, now I know it's before your time. In 1968, you had the Tet Offensive. Now, you talk to South Vietnamese, and they'll tell you that for the first time they thought we were going to win. After the Tet Offensive, they thought, son of a gun, we're going to win this war, mm-hmm. because it was a massive defeat for the communists. They came out of their holes and they attacked, and they got clobbered by the South Vietnamese and the American forces, and tens of thousands of them were killed. But Walter Cronkite made the decision that, safely ensconced in a newsroom back in Washington, that it was a defeat. And he told the American people that it was a defeat, and that we couldn't win. And Lyndon Johnson said, if I've lost Walter Cronkite, I've lost the war. Wow. That's the kind of power they had. And they transformed a victory into a defeat. And they want to get back to that situation. They want to get back to where they have a monopoly. Some of you will remember when Dan Rather tried to destroy the candidacy of George W. Bush in 2004, mm-hmm. By saying that he dodged the draft by using influence to get into the Texas Air National Guard. If Dan Rather had done that story in 1992, it would have worked. But by 2004, on the alternative media, on Facebook and on Twitter, they had shown within 24 hours that the whole thing was a hoax, that had been set up, an elaborate hoax. And in fact, CBS did a subsequent study that found out that George W. Bush had indeed volunteered as a pilot in the Texas Air National Guard to go to Vietnam, but that he was disqualified because the plane he had been qualified to fly was considered obsolete and was not being used in combat. And the fact that, I lived, my brother lived in Texas. I lived in Texas. I was a student at Princeton, but I guarantee you in 1968, if you wanted to get into the Texas Air National Guard and be a pilot, there was not a waiting list because it was not the 6 months active duty and then 5.5 years of guard duty. It was 18 months of flight training and then 6 months of active duty and then 5.5 years. And if you wanted to fly and you qualified to fly a jet, there was no waiting list to get in.
So we've talked about the fact that we have multiple layers by which we can have our grievances aired. We can encounter things that we disagree with and provide counter arguments and those sorts of things.
And our revolutionary forefathers would say, they'd be the first to say that we are not justified in resorting to violence because we have the peaceful redress of grievance that they fought a war to get us the right to
maintain. Yep, exactly. Right. Exactly. And again, for the record, Dr. King was not advocating rioting. It was a description, not a prescription.
He was seeking to explain he was seeking to explain the phenomenon without condoning it.
Exactly. So to wrap up, back to Aquinas, after he did his on the contrary portion, then he would lay out his argument for whatever position he was talking about. And then he would go back and have a I answer that section and go back and answer all the questions that he had raised to begin with. So we're going to close out with a I answer that. All right, so it would be more fun if we had callers calling in and doing all those sorts of things, but we're just going to, I just want to throw out a few questions for you that people may be having related to what we've talked about. So, again, we talk a lot about Aquinas here at SES. We're very deep in the natural law, classical natural law tradition that Aquinas, I think, really made clear and advocated for, which
is ensconced in the Declaration of Independence.
A version of that certainly is, absolutely. Yeah. But in Aquinas' writings, he actually talks specifically about forms of government. He talks about tyrannical governments, and he talks. Well, actually, Dr. King mentions in his letter from a Birmingham jail about an unjust law is no law at all, referring to Aquinas and Augustine and the natural law tradition. But Aquinas talks about the legitimacy of fighting to remove a tyrant. And again, back to the extremes on both sides that the people are coming from. For the last 4 years, we've heard that Trump is a tyrant that needs to be removed. Yeah. Is he a tyrant?
No, not at all. He didn't do a lot of things that Obama did. Obama did a lot more tyrannical things when he was in office, like spying on newsmen, which he did, and using the intelligence services illegitimately. And some of us believe that he was behind the whole attempt to tip the scales in favor of Mrs. Clinton in 2016, and then afterwards trying to delegitimize and undermine President Trump by setting this whole Russian nonsense into play, which has now been shown to be complete, utter nonsense, started by a portfolio paid for by Hillary Clinton and done by a foreign secret agent and used by the CIA.
Well, and even just back to our previous part of the conversation, the fact that a private technology company can censor the president of the United States without recourse and punishment. Should
Yeah,
be pretty good evidence that he's not a tyrant.
no, he's not, and you know he was criticized for not having a better control of the pandemic because he respected states' rights.
Right.
And we have some idiots who are governors. And of course, people have often said people have the kind of government they deserve. So if you have an idiot governor, you elected them, and there's a way to correct that. You can unelect them in the next election. It's same thing with the rollout of the vaccine. I just signed up. I just signed up for I became eligible in my age group, and I can get my first shot April 17th. April
Nice.
17th. That's one of the penalties of living in North Carolina, where we have an idiot governor.
Yeah, for those of you who are listening to the recorded version, that's 3 months from now when we're recording this
Yeah,
conversation.
if I lived in South Carolina or I lived in Tennessee, it'd be earlier.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's so.
I hasten to point out, Tennessee and South Carolina have Republican governors.
Absolutely. It just confuses me so much, the back and forth hypocrisy of, and this is not a podcast to support Trump. It's just examining ideas, and this is one of the ideas that's been thrown around for 4 years, that he's a tyrant. But with the pandemic, had someone wanted to gain tyrannical control of a government, that was the perfect opportunity to enforce certain prerogatives that may or may not have
Well,
been.
that's right, and he showed great restraint
Right.
in following the Constitution and respecting states' rights in a way that has not been done in some other crises. For instance, in World War II, under the emergency powers of a war, Franklin Roosevelt did not pay much attention to this at all. I mean, for instance, he didn't leave it to the state of California whether to put Japanese Americans into concentration camps. That was a federal edict, and it happened overnight.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, assuming Jesus doesn't come back between now and tomorrow, Biden's going to be inaugurated. I wish he would. I'm all for it. Come quickly, Lord Jesus. But presumably Biden will be inaugurated.
Yes.
Should Christians be worried going forward?
They should be concerned. The first thing they should do is obey the Bible, which is they should pray for the president. We're commanded to pray for the president. I've prayed for every president from Eisenhower forward. I was taught to do that by my parents in a Christian home. And by the way, my parents canceled out each other's vote the whole time I was growing up because my father was a Democrat and my mother was a Republican. They both started voting the same way. I think Reagan was the first time they both voted the same way, and they voted the same way from then on. But when all the time I was growing up, it was AC and DC. We need to pray for the president. The heart of the king is in the hand of the Lord, according to the book of Proverbs. So we need to pray that God will guide and direct Mr. Biden. And I also would remind people that you never know how things are going to work out. I was, frankly, despondent when Jimmy Carter was elected president, because I knew from research and from people I knew in Georgia just how terrible the president he was going to be. But if we had not had Jimmy Carter, we wouldn't have had Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan would never have been elected president 4 years later if it hadn't been for the disaster that was Jimmy Carter. And I think Ronald Reagan is justifiably considered one of the three most consequential presidents of the 20th century, along with Franklin Roosevelt and Harry Truman. I was not happy when Bill Clinton won in 1992. I was not happy that we were electing someone to the presidency who was that morally challenged, which he obviously was. And yet, if it hadn't been for Bill Clinton, we wouldn't have had the Republican takeover of Congress in 1994. We wouldn't have had welfare reform. We wouldn't have had all the good things that were done by the Republican-controlled Congress. And now I know, Adam, a lot of our folks who are listening to this, they think, well, what kind of a big deal was that? Well, the Democrats had controlled the House of Representatives from 1948 until 1994.
Mm.
That's a long time.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, I had no conscious memory of the Republicans ever being in control of Congress and having the Speaker of the House. I was in an airport coming back from a speaking engagement in upstate New York when they announced that the Republicans had won like 50 seats and that they actually had gained control of the House. I couldn't believe it. I had to sit down and sort of absorb the fact that there was going to actually be a Republican-controlled House of Representatives.
Mm-hmm.
They balanced the budget. Remember that? They balanced the budget. And they did a lot of things that were very important to the country.
Mm-hmm.
It would never have happened had George H.W. Bush been elected to a second term.
Mm-hmm.
It was the dissatisfaction with Bill Clinton's policies that led to the Republicans taking over Congress. And now, of course, it moves back and forth in a more normal way, in the way it has for most of our history.
Yeah.
So you never know. You never know what the consequences of an election are going to be. And we never know how God's going to work. But I will say this. I will say that Chuck Colson was right when he said that it was a sin for Christians to be pessimists.
Mm.
Now, I love my country. I think my country has been a force for good in the world. And I hope that America's best days are yet ahead of her. But God may be through with America. If he is, I couldn't complain. Any country that allows child sacrifice of nearly 70 million babies is certainly worthy of God's judgment.
Yeah.
But God is not through with his church, and he will fulfill his purposes for his church. And so as Christians, we're to be optimistic because our ultimate allegiance is to the Lord Jesus Christ and to his church, not to the United States of America.
Yeah. Well, that's a great segue to our last question, which is, we know the woke ideology, the cancel culture, uh, just a complete inability to understand objective goodness. We know those things are just going to continue to get worse for the foreseeable future. So how can Christians prepare, and what can we do to start turning the tide?
Well, they may not get worse. I mean, I think that that the overreach of that, the inevitable overreach and the
Mm-hmm.
inevitable arrogance of those positions, is going to lead to a backlash. I think it already is starting to lead to a backlash.
I hope so.
Well, I think there's already a backlash to the impeachment. I wrote a column in which I said, the Democrats wanted to impeach the president after he's left office, which I'm not sure is legal. Because the impeachment process is there to remove a president from office. Once he's left office, I'm not sure that you can impeach him. If I were the president, I would take it to court immediately. But it sounds like what the Royalists did when they came back to power in 1660. Oliver Cromwell, who had been the leader of the Commonwealth that replaced the monarchy during the Puritan Revolution. They dug him up out of Westminster Abbey. He died in 1658. They dug him up. They cut off his head. They hung him, and then they cut off his head and put his head on a pike in outside Westminster until 1685. I mean, that's what I think some people would like to do to Donald Trump. I mean, it's like, give it a rest. The guy lost the election. He's leaving office. I think that piling on like that or seeking to charge him with things after he leaves office will be seen as an overreach and certainly as divisive. When you have approximately half the country that voted for him, it's divisive. I mean, I think that Gerald Ford did a very patriotic thing in pardoning Richard Nixon. It probably cost him the election. He got behind in the polls after he did it, and he never caught up. But it was the right thing to do. It would have torn the country apart in 1974 and 1975 to see Richard Nixon in court having to defend himself against charges brought by the federal government. It just was unnecessary, and it would have been counterproductive, and it would have contributed to a lack of reconciliation in our country. And I think the same thing is true if they seek to relentlessly persecute Donald Trump in his retirement.
So if listeners or viewers are interested in how Christianity, how natural law, how those things relate to the political sphere, to government in general, You actually helped us start a philosophy, politics, and economics certificate at Southern Evangelical Seminary, which, if you're listening or watching, you can go to ses.edu/PPE. That's for philosophy,
Well,
politics, and economics
God,
to check that out.
as far as I can tell, Adam, God only ordained three institutions in human society. He ordained the family, He ordained the church, and He ordained government.
Mm-hmm.
The civil magistrate is ordained by God to punish those who do evil and to reward those who do that which is right. And we're to be subject to the powers that be for conscience sake, unless we can't do otherwise. It means we can't disobey laws unless our moral conscience tells us we cannot obey that law,
Mm-hmm.
and then we need to obey it. We need to disobey it um, um, uh, non-violently.
Yeah, peacefully.
Now, one thing that we've sort of skirted around it, but we haven't talked about it, and that is there ever a time when violence or armed protest is justifiable? And I think there is. I'm not sure I can define it. It's sort of like what Potter Stewart said, Justice Potter Stewart of the Supreme Court said about pornography. He said, I can't define it, but I know it when I see it.
Right.
Dr. King is purported to have said this in response to a question questioning his nonviolence, because he was a profound admirer of Gandhi and of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. And of course, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, in the end, abandoned his commitment to nonviolence by participating in the plot to assassinate Adolf Hitler.
Mm-hmm.
And King was asked about this. And King's response purportedly was, and listen very carefully to this because it's really very, 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 very well done. If your opponent has a conscience, follow Gandhi. If your enemy has no conscience, follow Bonhoeffer.
Mm.
And so he was saying that there could be a place where a government was so evil, as in the Third Reich, that it was necessary to participate in violence to overcome that evil.
Mm-hmm.
But that's an extraordinary circumstance, and one that I hope that we as Americans will never face. As I was reading Bonhoeffer's writings, I thought about how agonizing that must be, because we have to assume that he loved Germany as much as I love the United States.
Mm-hmm.
And to come to the place where you believe that your country is in the grip of such monstrous evil that it is your Christian duty to work for the defeat of your own country must be a terrible, terrible, terrible thing, and one that I hope and trust and pray we will never encounter.
Indeed. Come quickly, Lord Jesus. Well, Dr. Land, I think that's all our time. I appreciate you being with us and providing some insights, answering some questions. It was enlightening for me. I hope our viewers and listeners will enjoy it.
Well, if they want to, I've got some copies of a booklet that I did. If they want to request it, we can send it out as long as we have them, or maybe we can run it online. It's called One Nation Under God, and I print the Declaration and the Constitution together because they're meant to be as a seamless whole. The Declaration is our reason for being. It's the set of American principles that we adhere to, and then the Constitution is the implementing document. Mm-hmm. Now, the liberals sometimes try to do away with the Declaration of Independence, and they say, well, it's just the Constitution. And the reason they do that is the Constitution doesn't mention God. The Declaration does. I had an argument about this, a debate about this with some liberals, and I won it by using arithmetic. I said, our greatest president, and he's retired the title, we'll never have another president as great as Abraham Lincoln. When he spoke at Gettysburg, he said, 77 years ago, our forefathers brought forth on this continent a new nation. Well, if you subtract 77 from 1863, you come up with 1776. Not 1619, sorry, New York Times, and not 1787 when the Constitution was ratified, but 1776. If you want to know what it means to be an American, it means that you believe in and you give assent to and confidence in the principles that are laid out in the Declaration of Independence. We believe that all men are created equal, and they're endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. And that among these are life, liberty and the pursuit of happiness.
Indeed. Dr. Land, thank you again. We appreciate it very much.
Glad to be with you.
We'll see you next time. All right. Well, once again, if you're interested in learning more about being an SES student, and now I have hopefully you don't see that on the live stream. We'll see a little notification there. You can visit degrees.ses.edu/podcast to download our free ebook, 3 Reasons Why a Seminary Education May Be Right for You. And again, this content doesn't get delivered by itself. Students don't get taught by themselves. We can't do what we do to equip the church without your help. So if you're interested in partnering with us in any way, please visit ses.edu to learn more about that and the various ways you can partner with us. So we call this show, Why Do You Believe? And the only reason to believe anything is because it's true. So I hope you'll go share truth with someone today.
Providing an integrated approach to theology, philosophy, and apologetics that will equip you to proclaim the gospel, engage the culture, and defend the truth. That's SES.